Hello. This week, our discussion of early U.S. history is going to focus on the time period right after the French and Indian War, where England decides to start reasserting its authority over its 13 colonies in North America. We'll talk about some of the reasons why England decided to do this after so many years of what we call salutary neglect, and we'll also discuss how this sudden enforcement of British law in the colonies will eventually lead to the American Revolution. If you remember last week when we finished the French and Indian War, we talked about how England's empire in North America had pretty much doubled in size. In terms of territory, this is going to be very expensive to maintain. And of course, taking a look at our map here to refresh our memories, remember prior to the French and Indian War, England's territory was focused primarily on the east coast of North America. This is where our 13 colonies are. They had a little bit of land up here in what is today Canada, but they weren't real concerned with this. This was the main focus of their effort. After the French and Indian War, when France was forced to give up all of its possessions in North America, England now controls all of North America east of the Mississippi River. So this is a huge increase in its territory in North America. And just in terms of trying to manage and control this territory, it's going to be very expensive to maintain. Troops will have to be stationed along the frontier to protect this territory. It'll be expensive in terms of exploring and settling this region. So this large amount of territory, while it's a big benefit to England in terms of its colonial empire, it's going to be very expensive to maintain this larger territory, much more so than in previous years. In addition to this burden of maintaining this large empire, England also is left with a massive debt after the French and Indian War, which of course was the last in a series of colonial wars for empire that were very expensive for England in terms of funding these wars, and then of course trying to pay off the debt that was accumulated. Taking a look at this chart here, we can see a good visual representation of how this debt was accumulated over this time period. We're looking at a time period here that spans all of these colonial wars for empire and even extends on to the American Revolution, which will be essentially the final war that England will fight to protect its empire. As you can see here, we've got three different groups of money here, categories of money. We've got military spending in the red line, and of course our tax revenues that England is collecting over this time period in the green line, and then down at the bottom here we have the blue line, which represents what England is spending domestically on British society. This is what they're spending back in England. So every time we see one of these wars for empire taking place, we see a dramatic spike in military spending. And this is no big surprise. Wars are not cheap. They cost a lot of money to pay the soldiers, to pay for the Navy, to pay for supplies and equipment, and so on and so forth. Wars are very expensive. So it's no big surprise here that military spending will spike every time there's a major war. And this pattern will continue on through the American Revolution. This is just part of history. Even today, wars are very expensive. If you looked at America's, United States' current spending, you'll see that in times of war or conflict, there is a big spike in military spending. This is just a common pattern. But the real problem is the fact that while we have big spikes in military spending, we don't see a corresponding spike in tax collection. So the government is spending money here, but it's not taking any more money in terms of tax revenues. So what's happening here is they're borrowing all this money. In order to pay for these wars, England is borrowing heavily to fund these wars. They're not paying for it through taxation. So what ends up happening is that England is accumulating massive amounts of debt. Every time there's a war, they accumulate more debt, and so on and so forth, until it gets to the point where they simply cannot afford to take on any more debt. And from the perspective of the British people back in England, they are particularly aggravated about it because you'll notice this line here representing domestic spending in England is almost non-existent. So while England is racking up a massive amount of debt to protect its colonies, they're not spending any money on the British people, and this goes on for a long time. Eventually the British people will become very angry and upset over this, which will be one of the factors in influencing England's desire to make peace with the newly formed United States at the end of the Revolutionary War, because they just simply cannot afford to keep up this pattern. So we've got twice as much territory to maintain, very expensive, and in addition to that we have a massive war debt to pay for. So England is in an economic situation at this point where they are desperate for money. They need to start generating revenue if they're going to maintain this vast empire. Next on their list of problems is the fact that within the 13 colonies in North America, the population is growing very rapidly. By the time we get to 1770, and this is just a few years after the French and Indian War, there's more than 2 million people living in British North America. A lot of the cities here, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, Charleston, a lot of these cities rival some of the bigger cities in Europe in terms of population and economic activity and culture. So we see this is not just a ragtag band of frontier settlers anymore struggling to survive. This is a huge piece of the British Empire. A lot of people living in large, well-established cities. In addition to that, the colonies are not just growing and prospering, they are interacting with each other on a more regular basis. And this is probably one of the most important pieces of our story. In the early days of the colonies, there was no interaction between the colonies. Virginia and Massachusetts simply didn't have anything to do with each other. At this point now, Virginia and Massachusetts are trading with each other and communicating and interacting with each other on a regular basis. So there's a lot of interaction among the colonies, and this leads directly to a developing sense of unity, this sense of common identity that is starting to grow in the 13 colonies. They are beginning to think of themselves as a single group of people, more so now than they had in the past. And this is due, again, according to the press, politics, republicanism. All these ideas are going to feed into this. There's a lot more newspapers in the colony by this point, so a lot more information is spreading to a lot more people in a shorter period of time. Local politics have become very important. Keep in mind our sense of independence and self-governing that began to develop very early on. We here in the colonies are starting to think of ourselves as able to take care of our own business without having to have England supervise us. And this idea of republicanism, a representative government that derives its power and authority from the consent of the people. This is one of our Enlightenment ideals. This idea is now spreading more completely through colonial society. People are starting to think in terms of how their society relates to its government, what role the government should play. So a lot of these ideas are starting to affect the way these 2 million people think and go about their lives, what they imagine to be the ideal form of government. So this is a big deal. All this adds up to a situation where these 13 colonies are not just inconsequential groups of settlers that don't really play a role in the story. This is becoming a society with a character all of its own, and culturally, economically, the colonies are starting to pull away from their parent country of England. And this probably is another really important piece here, this idea of a colonial economy. When you think back to the idea of mercantilism, wherein an empire generates wealth through its colonies. The colonies serve as a source of raw materials, and then of course as a market for finished goods, manufactured goods. And this is what generates wealth for an empire. By the time we get to the mid 1700s, we're going to see that, well, between 1735 and 1775, a period of about 40 years, we're going to see that trade between the colonial North America and England is going to double. And then in that same period of time, trade among the colonies, and this is, the colonies trading with each other, is going to increase 400%. And this is huge. This is in a very short space of time. In less than a space of a generation, we're going to see intercolonial trade increasing 400%. This represents a massive amount of economic activity. Not just people buying their day-to-day products and goods that they need for themselves, but this is also, we see a significant amount of manufacturing taking place in the colonies during this time period. Over the same time period, the mid 1700s, we see the colonies begin producing significant amounts of manufactured goods, particularly in iron production and some small cottage industries, producing finished products. But shipbuilding is probably the biggest piece of this. Shipbuilding during the 1700s was a major industry. Everything traveled by boat during this time period, so ships were an essential part of any kind of economy. So shipbuilding is a major industrial activity during this time period. Most up to this point, shipbuilding was done mainly in England in terms of the British Empire, British trade. They built all their own ships, but given the fact that the colonies were so far away, a lot of times they just built ships here in the colonies, especially in the New England area, with a ready supply of raw materials, with the forests and so forth. They're able to, it's more cost effective to build the ships here in the colonies than it is to send all the raw materials back to England and have them build the ships there. So, and this was not planned. The colonies just started doing this. And England, again, through this salutary neglect, had ignored a lot of this activity over the previous 50 years or so. So when we see England finally starting to get involved in colonial affairs, they're shocked at the fact that the colonies are producing so many manufactured goods. In many ways, in fact, in terms of shipbuilding, the colonies are actually competing with England on this. And you have to remember that the purpose of a colony is to provide the parent country with raw materials, and they are supposed to purchase the finished products from the parent country. Here, the colonies in North America are doing just the opposite. They're doing exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing. They're not supposed to be manufacturing anything, and here they are manufacturing tons of finished goods that are competing with British trade. Just to give you some numbers here in terms of shipbuilding, in 1750, the colonies were producing about 600 sailing ships every year. By the time we get to 1770, the colonies are producing over 1,000 ships each year, and this is a huge business. Thousands of Americans are employed in this shipbuilding trade. A lot of money is changing hands. This is a very profitable industry. Again, this is cutting very deeply into England's economy. The colonies are benefiting from all this shipbuilding instead of England, which is what it's supposed to be. So England is in a situation now where they're losing a lot of money in terms of trade and economic activities because the colonies are trading among themselves and they're not abiding by the Navigation Acts, the trade laws that England had established previously. So for all these reasons, this increased territory, war debt, a growing population and cultural identity in North America, and a rapidly expanding economy. Excuse me. For all these reasons, England now is faced with some very tough choices. They are going to have to become more directly involved in colonial affairs or risk losing their empire in terms of its economic value. When we look at a map here, we can get a better idea of how colonial North America is becoming more fully incorporated into this transatlantic trade that's been developing over the previous 200 years. This map is dated 1770. We looked at a map similar to this a week ago, and it was dated 1650. So in 100 years, in about 100 years, uh, British North America has gone from barely even existing to being the most significant piece of this transatlantic trade. The most valuable piece of this trade network is now British North America. So England is determined to protect this, to keep it within its own empire, to keep it under control. And it's not necessarily about political control, it's about economic wealth. England established these colonies in order to generate wealth for itself. At this point, a lot of the wealth that's being generated is being generated here in the colonies, and England is not benefiting from it. So this is what gives England the motivation here to start becoming more involved. It's about keeping control of their business, their economic activity. So let's talk a little bit about how England is going to do this. It's a huge task, and it's going to happen in a lot of small pieces. It's hard to get started, and a lot of it goes unnoticed at first. It's going to be kind of gradual, but it's going to pick up very fast once it does get started. From the colonial perspective, here in the 13 colonies of North America, the most visible evidence of tightening British controls is the presence of large numbers of British troops here in North America, which previously had not been the case. Taking a look at our maps here, in the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War, we see large numbers of British troops stationed here in North America, and this is no big surprise. For obvious reasons, the British troops were here fighting the French and their Indian allies for control of this region. So it's no big surprise that there are large numbers of British troops stationed all over North America, especially here in the northeastern part where most of the fighting took place. No big surprise. What is kind of disturbing from the colonial perspective is that 12 years later, these British troops are still here. Now you can see, according to the 1775 map, the British troops are now consolidated around the major cities. So they're not dispersed all over the countryside like they had previously been during the war. They're now concentrated in the major population centers. And you'll notice Boston here very, very conspicuously seems to have a disproportionate amount of British troops compared to other cities in the colonies. So this is a very visible indication that England is controlling the colonies more directly now than they used to be. Prior to the French and Indian War, you could go your whole life and never see a British soldier. After the French and Indian War, seeing British soldiers here in North America is a very common occurrence. It's a part of everyday life. So the very visible indication that England is now attempting to control these colonies more so than it had in the past. Salutary neglect is over. England is here, and they're making their presence known, and they are attempting to control what's going on here in a more active way than they had in the past. No sooner does the fighting in the French and Indian War cease when England is going to be faced with a new conflict on the frontier, Pontiac's Rebellion, and it begins in 1763. Again, this is the year that the French and Indian War ends. We're going to have another conflict on the frontier, and in this case, it's an old story: Indians versus settlers over land. And this is a pattern that will repeat itself over and over again throughout our story. This time, though, the conflict is in the Great Lakes area, and the Ottawa Indians, led by a chief named Pontiac, are going to start pushing back against British settlers in this area. There's a couple of different issues here other than just land. The Ottawa Indians have been kind of exploited in the previous years by British traders, and that starts to pick up in this year after the French have been expelled from North America. British trappers and traders begin exploiting the Indians a little bit more aggressively, and Pontiac is very frustrated with how the English are treating them, especially after the English offered new treaties guaranteeing Indian land rights. And we see here those treaties being violated almost immediately after the war is over. Pontiac has had enough. He's reached the point where this is kind of the last straw for him. So he gets the Ottawa Indians in the Great Lakes area organized and starts a rebellion. And it plays out in very similar ways we've seen in the past. They start attacking frontier settlements and small towns and villages of settlers. And this, of course, attracts attention of the British colonial governments, and they begin to push back against the Indians. This will be kind of an on again, off again. It's going on for 3 years, but it's not going to be 3 constant years of fighting, or it's not going to escalate into a major war. It's just going to be kind of sporadic, on again, off again fighting on the frontier between British settlers and the Ottawa Indians. Now, as an immediate, couple of immediate effects are going to be resulting from this rebellion. To begin with, England is going to station about 6,000 British soldiers on the frontier, and they'll be dispersed in numerous forts along the frontier, again to help protect the British colonial frontier from further Indian rebellions. Another thing that the British government is going to do in order to help avoid this type of conflict on the frontier is they're going to pass the Proclamation of 1763. And this is not long after the rebellion starts. They try to get out in front of it by passing this proclamation. Now, there's nothing they can do about the people that are already moving onto the frontier. They're already out there. This conflict is already going. But this proclamation of 1763 is intended to prevent any additional settlers from moving onto the frontier and further aggravating this already tense situation. So essentially, in a nutshell, this proclamation declares that no new settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains is going to be allowed after 1763. This is partly in a response to Pontiac's rebellion and these type of situations where increasing numbers of settlers start moving into this former French territory and aggravating an already tense situation with the Native Americans. Now, it's useful to point out here that England is not really that concerned over Indian land rights. That's not the big concern here. We all know that how the story plays out. Eventually, England and then later on the United States will take all the land from the Indians. So concern over Indian land ownership is not a big priority here. What is of primary concern to the British government is avoiding another major conflict right after they finished the previous one. Again, this is 1763. The French and Indian War is just barely over at this point. The last thing England needs is another major conflict that's going to add up more expense, more debt, and they're already in a situation where they can't even afford the debt that they've already incurred. And an additional war at this point would really hurt England economically. So they want to avoid this type of situation. And they figure the easiest way to do that is just to keep the settlers from moving further onto the frontier. Looking at a map here, we can see where this proclamation line lays. Of course, this is just an arbitrary line. It follows the spine of the Appalachian Mountain Range. This is, at this point, this is kind of a de facto border between colonial settlements and Indian territory. There's no actual border here. It's just by the mid-1700s, this is about as far inland as any colonists have moved. Keep in mind, these mountains here prevent a lot of farms and settlements from being constructed. So this is kind of a natural barrier between colonial settlements on the coastal plain and Indian territory in the Ohio River Valley. So this, they just say west of the Appalachian Mountains is off limits to new colonial settlements. If you're already living out here, they're not going to come get you or make you move back, but they're not going to let any new people move out here. This is going to be a big source of aggravation for the colonists, because in most of their minds, people were anxious to move into this new territory. We just fought all these wars against France for control of this Ohio River Valley, all this great farmland out here in the frontier. We're looking, we spent all this time fighting the French so we could gain access to this land, and now the French are gone. Why can't we go out there and start building new settlements? This is the big question in everybody's mind. Why is the English government stopping us from moving out here? And of course, the these treaties with the Native Americans are of little consequence to most of the settlers. They just see an opportunity for prosperity out here on the frontier, and a lot of people are upset about this proclamation line. So this is going to be one of the first big laws or regulations that England is going to pass in an attempt to try and control its colonial empire. In addition to regulations and new laws, we're going to see a wave of new taxes being imposed on the colonies. And this is where the story really starts to get interesting, because people in the colonies are going to become very aggravated over these new taxes. And this is just human nature. This is not a big surprise here. For most people, you can make laws and rules and talk about restrictions, and they usually will just ignore you. Once you start getting your hands into their wallet, that's when you've got their attention. You start taking people's money, and they start paying attention to what you're doing. So these new taxes are really going to start to get people's attention here and start focusing colonial animosity toward the British government. It begins in '64 with the Sugar Act. This is not a really big deal. The Sugar Act, it's a tax on luxury imports coming into the colonies. And this doesn't create a huge problem right away, because for two main reasons. First, a tax on imports, goods, luxury goods imported into North America. This is not a big deal because it's perfectly consistent with existing British trade law. England had always taxed goods that were imported into the colonies. This is nothing new, so nobody really pays much attention to it. It doesn't draw a lot of attention. And for the second reason, probably most significant, is that this is a tax on luxury goods. Things like sugar, coffee, wine, things that are produced in Europe that are being imported into North American colonies. Most people can't afford these things anyway. A lot of the working class people, the frontier farmers, they can't afford these luxury goods. So the only people this really affects are the wealthy, the social elites. To put it in today's terms, it'd be kind of like if the federal government started putting a tax on Ferraris. Well, that's not going to, most working class people in America aren't even going to notice, because we can't afford a Ferrari in the first place. So we're not going to be too concerned about a tax on these luxury imports. So this Sugar Act doesn't draw a lot of protest from the colonies, because it simply doesn't affect that many people. In addition to this, England begins actually enforcing the Navigation Acts now. So for the first time since the laws were passed way back in the mid-1600s, England now begins actively enforcing these laws. They're going to use writs of assistance to catch people smuggling and black marketing. They're going to put these people on trial in vice admiralty courts. They're actually going to start catching a lot of people and enforcing these acts. Again, this will only affect primarily those who are actually doing the smuggling and the people who are buying these luxury goods, the wealthy elites and some of the black market traders. Most of the people in the colonies are not going to be impacted by this, because they simply don't purchase the goods and they're not involved with the black market trading. A year later, Parliament's going to pass the Stamp Act. And this is going to be a little bit more problematic, because this is going to be quite a bit different situation than the Sugar Act. The Stamp Act is a tax on all printed material. Things like newspapers, legal documents, marriage certificates, death certificates, any kind of license. All of these printed materials are going to be taxed. Basically, in order to get these printed materials, you have to have a stamp, well, just some sort of certification stamp on these goods that show that the tax has been paid. Kind of a modern day equivalent of this, like say if you need a license for something, or a building permit, or a marriage license, or something like that, or a birth certificate or death certificate, notarized or certified, you take it down to the courthouse and they're going to put a stamp on it. And to get this stamp, this official verification that this document is legitimate, you'd have to pay a fee. So this is kind of what we're talking. This is kind of a precursor to our modern notary type situation. So all this printed material is being taxed. This is what we refer to as an excise tax. A luxury import tax is a different type of tax. This is kind of an indirect tax. An excise tax is a direct tax. It's a tax on anything produced within the country. So these are things produced within the colonies. These legal documents, this printed material, newspapers are being printed here, legal documents are being produced here. So this excise tax, a tax on things produced locally, is a form of direct tax. And this is brand new. An import tax or an indirect tax, this has been in place for many years. People are used to this. They're already accustomed to this type of tax. This new type of tax, this direct tax, is something that has not taken place in the colonies before. Now, everybody back in England already pays this type of direct tax, but people here in the colonies have never paid taxes directly to England prior to this. They've always paid local taxes to the colonial government, and they've always paid their import taxes, but people here in the colonies are not used to paying a direct tax to the English government. So this is brand new, and as such, it's going to bring a lot of protest. People are going to be really upset about this Stamp Act, and to the point where a lot of people will start boycotting some British goods. We see the beginning of official or organized colonial protest. In the beginning here is just a few rich people grumbling about having to pay in higher prices on their luxury goods. When we get out of the Stamp Act, we see more people now complaining out loud and starting to actually protest the British government's exercise of this tax. In terms of protest, it happens a couple of different ways. For most people in the colonies, they're not in a position where they can protest anything. They don't have any real political power or influence. They're not rich. They're just regular people doing their own thing. So there's not a lot of options in terms of what they can do to actually protest. Some people will vandalize things. They just take out their aggression on the tax collector. Say, well, I don't want to pay. I disagree with these taxes. I don't want to pay them, so I'm going to go throw a rock through the window of the tax collector. We see a lot of this sort of thing happening in places that are hit hard by the taxes. The Boston Tea Party, which we'll talk about later on this week, is a good example of vandalism as a form of protest. But the go-to form of protest that we're going to see the most of in the colonies is a boycott. And a boycott is simply refusing to engage in or purchase any type of goods produced by a certain company, or in this case England, as a form of protest. So England raises a tax on sugar. Well, people in the colonies will start boycotting English sugar. We're not gonna buy any English sugar because we don't want to pay the tax on it. So this is kind of a passive-aggressive form of protest. You're not really doing anything. You're just refusing to purchase or to support these organizations that are responsible for the taxes. The problem with a boycott is that if one or two people decide to boycott a British import, no one's even going to notice. Even if 100 people are boycotting, if it's all random and disorganized, it's not going to have any effect at all. So here's where a guy named Samuel Adams is going to get the idea to start organizing this protest. Samuel Adams is a brewer in Boston, and he's one of these people that's kind of as a business owner. Of course, he's going to be affected by this Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. He's frustrated by the English taxes. It's kind of cutting into his business, but he knows that simply boycotting British goods is not going to be very effective. So he forms a group called the Sons of Liberty. And this group is dedicated to the purpose of organizing protest in the colonies. And eventually, of course, this is a Boston organization. Eventually, there'll be similar groups calling themselves Sons of Liberty in other colonies as well. But in the beginning, the early days, this is strictly a local group in the city of Boston. But in opinion of Adams and many others like him, in order for these boycotts to be effective, they need to be organized. So we need to get everybody, as many people as possible, boycotting the same British imports at the same time for it to have a significant impact. And if you can do it, if you can get a boycott organized, if enough people can participate in it, then it will significantly cut into the profits of whatever company is importing these luxury goods. So or whatever company is collecting all these taxes for printed material. So this is how it happens. Some newspapers will go out of business. They'll just stop printing newspapers. It's like, we don't want to pay this tax. We refuse. We don't agree with it. We refuse to pay it. So in order to do that, we'll just stop printing newspapers, and that way England won't be able to collect the taxes. Of course, this kind of hurts themselves too, because they're not collecting any profits from their newspaper business either. So some people will start boycotting British input. We're not going to buy any more British sugar. We're not going to buy any more British coffee. And eventually the sugar company and the coffee company, they'll lose enough money to where maybe they will start pressuring the British government to ease up on the taxes. So again, the boycott needs to be organized. It needs to be large scale in order for it to be effective. The Sons of Liberty and Sam Adams, these are the people that are going to start getting colonial protest organized. So instead of just a few random people whining and complaining, we're organized now. We're going to have a concerted effort, a group effort to protest British taxes. Eventually this protest will become much more organized, and it'll be a kind of an intercolonial movement, but in the beginning it's localized around the city of Boston. All right, same year as our Stamp Act, England will pass the Quartering Act. And this was, of course, when we look at this period of time, we tend to focus on the colonial protest and their anger over British laws, which seemed very oppressive and very unfair. And we kind of get that narrative stuck in our head, this idea that England was oppressing the colonies and taking away their rights and oppressing everyone. But it didn't start out like that. This was a perception of the colony. This is how the colonists perceived these acts. The Quartering Act, just like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, from England's perspective, was a matter of necessity. They needed to generate money to pay off their debt, so they started raising taxes. That's the way a government makes money, is they tax. So it seemed obvious from England's perspective that taxation was the best way to pay off this debt. Same thing with the Quartering Act. We've got troops stationed in the colonies to protect our new, larger empire. The troops need to stay somewhere. They need to eat. It seems obvious from England's perspective that since these troops are there to protect the colonies, then the colonists should be the one to pay the bill. So the Quartering Act requires that the colonial governments are now responsible for feeding and housing British troops that are stationed there. So while the Quartering Act does not specify that individual colonial citizens will be responsible for having British soldiers in their house, that's what ends up happening. The Quartering Act says that the colonial government, the local government, is responsible for taking care of these troops. So the local government just kind of passes the buck on down to the colonial citizens. So anybody that has a spare bedroom in their house, they're going to have British troops living with them. But if you got extra room in your barn, you're going to have a platoon of British soldiers living there. Now, this creates a lot of problems in several different ways. First and foremost, this is another form of indirect taxation. While the British government is not collecting money directly from the colonists now being responsible for feeding and housing these British troops is going to represent a significant increase in their financial burden. But, anybody that's ever served in the military can attest, soldiers will eat a ton of food. There's nothing more damaging to a cupboard than a hungry soldier. So these soldiers are going to eat a lot of food. They're gonna cut deeply into the household budgets of some of these families that are responsible for taking care of them now. Not only that, there's going to be a lot of from a cultural and social perspective, there's a lot of tension because, let's say, a farmer who is housing these British soldiers now in his spare bedroom, farmer's got a couple of teenage daughters. This is going to be a problem. You got lonely soldiers now living in your house with your teenage daughters. There's going to be a lot of tension, and it's going to be very disruptive to the household routine. Not only that, these soldiers who are eating all your food now and interacting with your family in a disruptive manner, they are also going to be interfering with the local economy. These British troops don't get paid very much money. At this time, and this is just the case. This is typical of all armies during this time of history. Soldiers are not paid very much money at all. For the most part, the government feels it's the duty of the soldier to serve his country, and he should do so. He should feel lucky to have the honor of serving his country. So they do pay the troops, but they pay them very little money. So a lot of these troops they're gonna look for part-time jobs to augment their income. While they're not doing military duties, they're going to get a job as a dock worker or a laborer downtown on their off-duty hours. What's going to end up happening, though, is that these British troops now are competing with local colonists for jobs that might be scarce in terms of the labor market. You're looking for a job in town. Now you got all these British troops down there looking for jobs too, and this creates a lot of tension in the local economy. So this creates a lot of problems here. The Quartering Act it hits everybody in a different way. It hits some people economically, it hits some people culturally and socially, and it just becomes a big burden to the colonists. A lot of people are going to be real aggravated about this. Not just the physical and economic burden that this creates, but a lot of people are asking, the big question here is, why are the troops here in the first place? Many people will say, the war is over. We get it. The troops had to come here to defend the colonies during the French and Indian War. That makes sense. We get it. We accept that. But the war is over. The French threat is eliminated. There's no more threat as far as protecting the colonies from Indians. In the city of Boston, they haven't seen an Indian in Boston for decades. So the colonists are asking, why are these troops here in the first place? And then, of course, in addition to that, why are we having to take care of them? So this is going to raise a lot of questions. It's going to create a lot of problems in the colony. And, of course, this affects a large number of people. So regular people now are being impacted by this, not just the wealthy elites paying taxes on luxury goods. This is going to affect a lot of people. So in the fall of 1765, our colonies are finally going to get their protest fully organized, and they're ready to now start petitioning the English government directly for some relief on these taxes and these new laws. So in the fall of 65, 9 out of the 13 colonies send representatives to New York City for a meeting. They call it the Stamp Act Congress. Their specific purpose is to oppose the Stamp Act. And they're not just there to gripe and complain. They're there to try to articulate their grievances in a way that will appeal to the English government. So they're trying to work within the system here. They're not just boycotting and vandalizing. That in the long run, those types of protests are largely ineffective. So what they're trying to do here is they're trying to work within the system, work within the confines of British law, and appeal to Parliament in an attempt to try and get some relief from these taxes, particularly the Stamp Act, which was seen by many as unjust. So this is here again is another example of colonies joining together, uniting in a common cause. Only this time, their common cause is opposition to English taxes. So we see here, while there's a lot of similarity between the Stamp Act Congress and the Albany Conference, here they are opposing England, whereas before they were just trying to figure out how to work together to resist the French. Here now they're opposing England. This is the first time the colonies are getting together to discuss a common problem which involves their protest of the British government. So here they're kind of turning a corner here. They are beginning to not only think of themselves as united in a common cause, but that common cause now is the British government. Their own government is the target of their protest here. So instead of just looking like, they don't want to look like a bunch of wild people vandalizing everything and protesting in the streets. They want to try and appeal to England in a mature and civilized way. So they write out this Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Basically, this is a formal petition to the British government, which outlines all their complaints over this Stamp Act. They mention a bunch of other things too. The Stamp Act is the primary focus of this document. So they draft a document outlining all of their grievances, and it outlines too their explanation or their rationale for these grievances. They see that and especially the Stamp Act as a violation of their rights under British law. They see the Stamp Act as being contrary to the ideals of republican government. They start to mention things like taxation without representation, and this is their big complaint here. They believe that Parliament is passing these tax laws without the consent of the people, because the colonies at this point, they don't have any representatives in Parliament. Parliament at this point is a true representative assembly representing the people of England within the British government. But the colonies themselves don't have any representation within Parliament, and this is their big argument. They say, we understand the need for taxes. We get it. The British government has a lot of debt that needs to be paid for. We understand why we're being taxed, and we're not so concerned about the taxes themselves, but we are concerned about the fact that these taxes were levied on us without our consent. We had no voice in the government. When Parliament voted to create these taxes, no colonial representatives were included in that vote. This is the big complaint here in this Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They are complaining that they don't have any representation in Parliament. So Parliament responds to this petition with a kind of a dismissive attitude. They say, okay, first of all, you all do have representation in Parliament. Every British citizen, every British subject is represented by Parliament. That's the whole purpose of Parliament, is to represent all the people of the British Empire. And since you all in the colonies are part of the British Empire, you are being represented in Parliament. So the people in the colonies now, they start to take this new approach. They start to argue against this idea of virtual representation. This is what Parliament is saying. You are all represented in Parliament by virtue of the fact you are British subjects. This virtual representation. The colonies now, colonial representatives start specifying here. It says, we don't want to be represented virtually. We want actual representation. We want someone from the colonies to sit in Parliament and voice our concerns. Basically, Parliament says that's never going to happen. You all have virtual representation, and that's good enough for us. You're never going to get actual representation. We're not going to allow somebody from the colonies to come here to London and sit in Parliament. So here's where the breakdown really begins. It's over this idea of virtual representation versus actual representation. This is where the colonists really start to get upset. They want actual representation. It's not about the money. They agree that of course, nobody likes to pay taxes. This is a given. But we all understand the necessity of taxation. It's just part of living in a civilized society. Taxes are going to be part of that scenario. The colonists understand this. But if they're going to pay taxes to a government, they want to be represented in that government. And this is the big issue here. Taxation without representation becomes the primary issue of colonial protest. And this will be a common thread. This will run all the way throughout these years of protest and even into the American Revolution. When we see the Declaration of Independence being written a few years later, this is going to be one of the big issues that they cite in that declaration. As luck would have it, the Stamp Act is only in effect for not even a full year. In fact, a lot of people won't even end up being affected by this Stamp Act because it's not on the books for that long. By the time the dust settles on this Stamp Act, Congress and Parliament refuses to entertain the idea of representation, we've got a new British Prime Minister. A new British Prime Minister, a guy named Rockingham. Lord Rockingham is going to become the Prime Minister in 1765, same year as this Stamp Act Congress is meeting. So the following year, Rockingham, who happens to be a little bit more sympathetic toward the colonial position than his predecessor, Lord Grenville, he's going to convince Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, and this takes place in the spring of 1766. So about a year after the Stamp Act is passed, it's going to be repealed by Parliament. Again, Lord Rockingham is somewhat more sympathetic toward the colonial position than any of his predecessors. So he convinces Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Okay, let's give them a break. Their request is not unreasonable. They've got a point here. We don't represent them in Parliament, so we kind of understand their argument. Plus, they've got all these boycotts going on. Eventually, that's going to cut into our economy and defeat the whole purpose of any of these taxes. So Parliament agrees to repeal the Stamp Act in the spring of '66, and in doing so, this goes a long way toward kind of settling this issue over taxation for the time being. This is a temporary respite in terms of taxation. So back in the colonies, we see some of the boycotts coming to an end. People in the colonial governments are a little bit more satisfied now that, okay, well, we did get some kind of satisfaction here over this Stamp Act. Parliament decided to repeal it, and of course, too, this reinforces the belief that, okay, if we work together, if we cooperate as colonial governments, if we formalize our protest and cooperate as one, as we get all our colonies together and act as one and protest the English government formally, then we can get some kind of results. And so this kind of reinforces that thinking among colonial leaders that cooperation in their protest will produce results. However, in the same moment that Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, in fact, it's all part of the same document. When Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, they pass the Declaratory Act. This is all happening at the same moment. And this is while there was some support in Parliament for giving the colonies a break on these taxes, their objective hasn't changed. Parliament is still determined to pay down English debt and to maintain control over its empire. So the goal hasn't changed. Yeah, they decided maybe the Stamp Act was a little bit excessive, so they decided to back off of that, but they still want to make sure that they achieve their objective, which is generating revenue from these colonies. So they passed the Declaratory Act, and basically, this doesn't institute any new laws. It doesn't change any laws. This is just kind of a political FYI. This Declaratory Act basically reaffirms England's power over the colonies. So in this Declaratory Act, Parliament is saying that, okay, colonies, just so you know, you are subjects of the British Empire. And as such, you are subject to British law. And Parliament, that's us, Parliament makes the law and you obey the law. The colonies are subject to England's power. And again, this is just to remind those colonial governments that they are not on their own. They are not in charge of anything, that they still must answer to England. So whatever laws that England passes, the colonies will be subject to those laws. It's kind of reminding them of who's in charge. So we see a lot happening here in the years following the French and Indian War. England is attempting to assert its control over its vast empire. They're attempting to generate revenue in order to pay off their debt. And we see, while from Parliament's perspective, everything they're doing is well within their rights, in this, as is defined by this Declaratory Act. Parliament doesn't see a big problem here, and neither does the king. because from their perspective, this is their empire. They can govern it in whatever way they want to. And as far as the taxes are concerned, and the British troops in the colonies, all of this debt is a result of England trying to defend the colonies. The colonies were unable to defend themselves. The militia was ineffective, so that they had to send British troops. It cost a lot of money, a lot of effort for England to defend these colonies. So from Parliament's perspective, it only seems fair that the colonies should have to pay part of the bill. And from Parliament's perspective, a lot of members of Parliament and the King too they're kind of confused at why the colonies will be so upset about this, because they're like, we were there to protect you, we're there to defend the colonies. It only seems fair that you all should have to pay for part of that. But from the colonial perspective, especially at the Stamp Act Congress, when these colonial representatives meet to discuss this, they don't see it in the same way. Keep in mind, this long era of salutary neglect has generated in the colonial mindset this assumption that they govern themselves. They take care of their own affairs, and this has happened for so many years that they all just assume that this is the way it's supposed to be. And they're all surprised when England starts cracking down on these laws. England didn't really pass any new laws. They're just enforcing all the laws that have already been on the books. And an attempt to try and understand this, for us to try to understand what's going on here in terms of the perceptions. We'll use our speed limit on the interstate metaphor again. We speed down the interstate. We go 80, 90 miles an hour every day on our way to work, commuting, traveling, whatever. We're flying down the interstate all the time, and nobody ever stops us. We become accustomed to this, and we start living under the assumption that it's okay. If it says, speed limit says 70 miles an hour, but I'm doing 80 and nobody ever said anything about it, then all of a sudden one day a state trooper pulls you over and gives you a ticket. Now, typically our first response is that, why are you picking on me? I'm being treated unfairly. I'm being abused here because I've been doing this every day and nobody said anything. Now all of a sudden you're cracking down on me. The natural human tendency is to feel like we're being treated unfairly, even though the law has always been there. It's always been against the law to speed. Just because we never got caught doesn't make it okay. And so here, from the state trooper's perspective, he's just enforcing the law the way it's always been. From your perspective, you feel like you're being abused because you never were held accountable prior to this. That's what's going on in this dispute between the colonies and the British government. From the British government's perspective, they are simply enforcing laws that have always been on the books. They are doing what is well within their right. They are governing their empire, as is their right to do so according to English law. But from the colonist perspective, the colonists feel like they are being abused and oppressed because they've never been required to obey these laws. Now all of a sudden they're being held accountable for things that many of them have totally forgotten about. They've forgotten about these navigation acts because nobody ever obeyed them. So we've got a kind of a breakdown in communication here. And this failure of both sides to see the other perspective is what's going to contribute a large part to the tension and the animosity that's going to begin growing over the next few years. Here's where it begins, is with these first few taxes. There'll be more in the coming years, and it's going to just kind of add more fuel to the fire. When we come back later this week, we will talk about some additional taxes and laws that England passes in an attempt to further assert their authority over the colonies. And of course, we'll see additional protests and animosity from the colonial perspective in response to these laws. So until then, we'll see you next time.